I'm Sarah. I'm from The Upcoming. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
Maybe you could just start by giving us a brief introduction to One Man in His Shoes. So for people who haven't heard about this documentary already, how do you give us a brief introduction to what it's all about?
Okay, yeah, so One Man in His Shoes is basically about the phenomenon of Air Jordan sneakers, told by the men and women who were partly responsible for making that phenomenon what it is today. So, yeah, it's a story that looks at, America's love affair with consumerism. It looks at the marketing savvy of Nike in the late 70s, early 80s, and throughout the 90s. And then it just looks at, the kind of the blueprint and the foundation of like sports athletes endorsing things, in the case of Michael Jordan endorsing sneakers, and how that brand has sort of like become the thing that it has become today, and sort of like penetrated all of these interesting facets of society, whether that be sort of like pop culture, music, entertainment, just all of those things. So yeah, that's pretty much the film in a nutshell.
And I understand it took a good few years to pull together. So what was it that first sparked your interest in this topic? Was it your own obsession with Jordans, with trainers? What brought you into it?
Well, I guess I've always had an affinity for trainers, but I would never call myself a sneakerhead or a connoisseur of any sort. I think that I thought about this idea because I was thinking about ideas that I might be able to live and sit with and, turn into sort of like a feature length idea. So I knew that they had to be ideas that I was connected to. They had to be ideas that I naturally was intrigued by or had some sort of like fascination or interest in. So that's when I started thinking about Air Jordan collectors specifically. That was sort of like the origin of this film. I kind of thought I was going to make a film about Air Jordan collectors, but then I realized quite quickly that that wasn't necessarily that exciting. I thought that, I appreciate the how impassioned and how enthusiastic those collectors are, and the levels that they go to get these sneakers, but I thought that the story perhaps needed something else. So then that's when I started thinking about the origin story of Nike, and Nike's relationship with Michael Jordan, and how that basically created the Air Jordan brand. So that's where it all started.
And it seems difficult to talk about this documentary without perhaps mentioning The Last Dance, which was a massive hit right in the middle of lockdown. I don't know whether that contributed to it, but a lot. I myself binge watched that, and I actually came to this documentary, I guess, being able to get a bit more out of it because I had that context. Me myself wasn't that familiar with all the story of the Chicago Bulls and Michael Jordan. So how do you see that this fits into that context? And I think what's also surprising is, even though that goes into so much depth over his career, this more niche documentary still has a lot new to say by zooming in on this one particular issue. So how do you see the two sit together, and how did you feel about that had come out before this one?
Yeah, no, I always knew that documentary series was in production, and I actually secretly hoped that our film would be out way before that came, because it was obviously this mammoth beast. And yeah, I kind of thought, oh no, like Netflix and ESPN are making this massive 10-hour series about Michael Jordan, but yeah, I kind of feel now that we exist in the slipstream of that, in the sense that what that showed the world, what that showed like broadcasters and commissioners and people that are important in television and film, that there is an appetite for Michael Jordan. So I think that helped us, a small little kind of like independent film who happened to sort of like come out at the same time as that was sort of like finishing. So yeah, I think it helped us massively that exists, and that everybody binge watched it. In terms of like the differences between editorial, I think that The Last Dance had one sole sort of like objective, and that was sort of like the career of Michael Jordan, but specifically his last season at the Chicago Bulls, and how that all that all played out. So, you know, they couldn't necessarily deviate too much away from that. You know, it had to be about his career. It had to be about, you know, specific games, and, you know, how, you know, those specific games went to sort of like creating his legacy. I think, you know, ultimately that series is about, you know, the genius of Michael Jordan from a competitive, you know, aspect, and from sort of like an athletic consideration. You know, he obviously did things that no other basketball player has ever done. So, but I think with our film, yes, it's about him, but it's also about his trainers, and it's about, you know, the brand of his trainers, and how everything that he was doing on the basketball court, you know, elevated, you know, the demand for his sneakers, because I think people wanted, you know, they wanted a piece of that excellence. They couldn't be Michael Jordan. They couldn't do the things that he was doing on the basketball court, but you can go out and buy his trainers, and then perhaps you could do those things. Like, obviously you can't, but that's what Nike and brand Jordan was selling us. So yeah, I think those are the two differences.
And there's quite a shift, I'd say, halfway through the documentary. First half kind of plays almost like a marketing case study, but it's also, you know, full of like lots of brilliant moments where you're thinking, oh, you know, this guy was such an icon, so inspiring, especially to the African American community in the US. And then we suddenly feel this shift where we're kind of then talking about people who are obsessive about collecting the trainers, and of course going to the darker moments of the violence and even murders that have happened. So was that something very conscious that you almost build up your audience feeling like, you know, everything was quite glowing, you know, looking at the impact, and then actually, no, there's this darker side?
Yeah, I think that the entry point to this film was to tell the definitive story of the Air Jordan sneaker. That's, you know, what myself and the two producers, like Will Thorne and Michael Marden, we'd always set out to do that. All three of us kind of like came of age in the 90s, and we remember, you know, what the Bulls were like. We remember how much the Jordan sneaker meant. So from that perspective, it made sense to explore, you know, the violence that has historically surrounded releases of the sneaker, you know, because unfortunately it's just something that has always gone hand in hand with, you know, the Air Jordan legacy. I kind of feel that this was happening in the late, you know, in the start of the 80s. This was kind of like happening. So yeah, I always knew that it was something that we weren't going to shy away from. I kind of thought that it was important for us to show how this phenomenon got as big as it is, and then, you know, the unfortunate byproduct of, you know, what that caused in you know, as far as the murders went. Sorry. So yeah, I always knew, basically in a nutshell, that we were going to explore that, because I'd never seen anything that had explored that, and I kind of felt a weight of responsibility to not rewrite history and just present all of the facts, and just leave it to the, you know, the viewer's discretion to sort of like make up their minds about what they think of that. So yeah.
And it does also seem to, you know, if we think about the Black Lives Matter movement, that resurgence earlier this year, there's been a lot of dialogue over, you know, the lives particularly of African Americans in the US, and you know, their interactions with the police. This obviously is in a slightly different area, but do you feel like this has added resonance, thinking about all that conversation that's happened this year as well?
I think there is a resonance. Yeah, I think yeah, there is this global sort of like uprising that is, you know, there's this global uprising that is happening with sectors and industries grappling with, you know, this issue basically. And I think that the film, you know, like you say, is a little, the third act is a little bit different, but it does touch on some of those, you know, indirectly, it does touch on some of those issues, I think. But I think what it says more importantly is just about the power of marketing, and like, you know, who gets marketed to and how that happens, and sort of like, you know, how that all sort of like plays out. So yeah, I think that there's definitely a resonance, but I think that it's a little bit more complex than sort of, you know, everything that we've seen. I think it's far more complex than everything we've seen in the last 6 months.
And it seems to resist kind of giving a ready conclusion. It's not sort of directly, blaming Nike or blaming Michael Jordan, but it's definitely kind of exposing all the issues and the impact of, perhaps, like you say, those quite aggressive marketing tactics, demand and supply being controlled. And, how do you think people are going to receive that? And, say if Michael Jordan watched this documentary, do you think there should be more responsibility taken for the impact of their practices?
Yeah, I kind of feel that, to answer the first bit of your question, the entry point to the film was always like fandom. Like, I was always a fan of Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. So this never, I didn't want it to feel like the third act to feel like a hit piece. I just wanted to be balanced and just say, well, these are all facts. Like, I don't have an agenda. I'm not going to tell you what to think as a viewer or manipulate you. I just kind of want to lay everything down and say, these things all happened. And, it's up to you to kind of like make your mind up. In terms of like corporate responsibility, I think the objective of any business is to sort of like make money. It doesn't matter which way we kind of think about it. We can't romanticize it. I think that's the objective of any business. And if your business doesn't make money, then it's going to go under and go bust, and nobody wants that. So I think, given that perspective and given that we know this, I don't think it's right for us to sort of like have these lofty expectations of like what we expect these businesses to sort of like do, and these corporations to sort of like say in relation to sort of these issues. I don't think it's necessarily, not that I don't think it's fair, I just don't think it's smart of us to kind of like, almost want that from our brands. Because if these brands and these corporations are set up and designed to sort of like make money, then that's obviously going to have an impact on, perhaps their moral compass when it comes to certain issues that don't necessarily involve making money. So I think that there's some truth in that. And I also think that the consumer is just becoming a little bit more savvy. I think the consumer can see, when they're being sort of like led down a garden path. And I think the consumer increasingly wants to know what these brands that they are buying into stand for. And I think brands know that. So it's sort of like a back and forth. It feels like a bit of a dance at the moment. I think there's a sophistication of the consumer, but then also there's a sophistication of brands. But I just kind of feel that, people will always buy and sort of like gravitate to things that they are, they like and they're interested in. But I also feel that, they are becoming more sophisticated in understanding the dynamics of, what this brand sort of like stands for and what it represents. And they will stay away if it doesn't sort of like represent their brand values or life values.
Thanks for your time, Yemi. It was lovely to speak to you.
And you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Have a good day. Bye.
And you. Bye.